Marla hadn't meant to drop it. Not the loaf, not her pride, but both landed in the same cold puddle outside Brixley's bakery just before noon. The loaf had cost her 3 days of stitching and blistered fingers, but the street didn't care. It slapped the bread with muddy water and spat it toward the gutter, right in front of 6 bystanders and a dog. "Careful, miss, you'll tilt the road again," someone snorted from a bench. She heard laughter, sharp and familiar, the kind that rolled behind her everywhere in town, not cruel enough to be punished, but loud enough to sting. Marla didn't bend down. She didn't cry. She just stared at the ruined loaf as the laughter built behind her, hands tightening around the woven handles of her basket. Her cheeks burned under the sun, and her boots sank slightly into the earth. That's when he stepped forward. A man, tall, broad, and quiet, walked past the bakery doors without a word. His coat was plain, his boots worn, his face sun-darkened and unreadable. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't look around for permission. He just crouched, picked up the loaf with both hands, held it a moment, then wiped it clean on the inside of his jacket and looked at her. "Yours?" he asked, voice low and sure. She nodded, unable to speak. "Then I'll carry it. And you?" His words weren't loud, but they landed heavier than anything thrown at her all year. The crowd hushed. Even the dog stepped back. He placed the loaf gently into her basket, then tipped his hat. "If you ever drop anything again, I'll be there," he added. Then he turned and walked toward the horses tied across the street. His name was Reese Calder. And she knew it without needing to ask, because only one man in this town hadn't laughed at her since she arrived. He never had. Not once. Not when she'd tried to sit on the chapel pew that creaked. Not when her skirt tore crossing the bridge. And not now. As he reached his horse, he looked back just once. She still hadn't moved. The bakery boy stood frozen at the counter, eyes wide, as if seeing her for the first time. Marla clutched the loaf like it was something sacred. She didn't know what had just happened or why it mattered so much, but the mud on the bread didn't shame her anymore. She turned slowly and walked home. Not fast, not embarrassed, but steady. For the first time in years, people stepped aside to let her pass. Marla had learned early not to speak her name too loudly. Names gave people permission, and the wrong people always took it. She rented a room above the seamstress shop, paid with mending and quiet, and never corrected the townsfolk who called her the fat one upstairs. Her parents were gone, her past burned in a house fire near Willow Creek, and since arriving in 3 Cedars, she'd survived mostly by not being noticed too much. But the next morning, she found her porch swept. A bundle of kindling had been left neatly by her door, and a linen-wrapped parcel rested on the step with her name on it. Written. Properly. Marla Grange. Not Miss, not Fat Girl, not even Ma'am. Just her name, whole and without comment. Inside the parcel was a warm loaf, identical to the one she'd dropped, only this one wasn't crusted with shame. It smelled like butter and safety. No note, just the bread. She looked out the window and saw Reese Calder again. He was standing beside the well, talking to the blacksmith about a broken wagon axle, calm as a resting ox. He didn't glance up, didn't wave, but he knew she'd seen him. She could feel it. Later that day, when she walked to the grocer, no one laughed. No one even whispered. And when she reached for a jar on the highest shelf, the clerk, who used to ignore her, walked over in silence, handed it to her with both hands, and nodded. Not kindly, not warmly, just respectfully. It was like something invisible had shifted. Reese hadn't made a speech, he hadn't raised a fist, but by lifting a loaf of bread in front of town and calling her mine, he'd redrawn the lines of how she was to be treated. Not owned, but seen. And Marla, who had bent her back to be invisible for so long, wasn't sure what to do with it. That evening, she baked. Not to please anyone, just to feel heat and sugar and worth in her hands. And as the honey cakes rose, so did something else inside her. A memory. When she was 11, her father had said, "Someday someone will choose you without you having to earn it." She hadn't believed him. But now she wasn't so sure. Because Reese Calder didn't want anything. He didn't flirt. He didn't linger. He didn't ask for favors or thanks. He just stood where others wouldn't. And in doing that, he'd named her without saying it. A person worth dignity. That night, Marla placed one of the cakes on a cloth and walked out under the stars. She didn't knock. She just left it on the rail by the stables. When she turned to leave, a voice behind her said softly, "That's my favorite kind." She didn't jump, didn't flinch, just turned back, face warm in the moonlight. "Then I hope it's sweet enough," she said. "If it's yours, it already is," he replied. Neither said more. They didn't need to. Sunday came with soft skies and the smell of dust warming on old roofs, and Marla decided, for the first time in a long time, not to skip the town gathering. She didn't wear anything special, just her cleanest dress and the ribbon her mother once wove into her hair before market days. But walking down Main Street felt different now. The whispers weren't gone, not fully, but they didn't pierce as deep. Because Reese Calder was already there. Standing still, arms folded by the water trough, leaning just enough for folks to notice, but not enough to make it a show. She could feel the shift. People were watching, but their eyes kept bouncing between her and him, unsure how to read this quiet partnership that didn't follow any of their rules. Marla didn't walk beside him. She didn't need to. She just walked past him slowly, and as she did, he tipped his hat. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud, but every pair of eyes caught it, and suddenly her body wasn't the center of the story. Her presence was. At the gathering, she sat on the side, near the back, just close enough to the baked goods table so she could help when needed. A child dropped his cornbread, and when she handed him a clean piece, the boy grinned and said, "You smell like cake." She laughed, really laughed, and didn't hide it behind her hand. Two older women glanced over and then looked away quickly, but not in disgust. More like confusion, like they'd missed a memo. Reese didn't hover. He just happened to always be nearby. When a man made a joke about needing a bigger chair, Reese didn't glare. He didn't fight. He simply turned, looked the man in the eye, and said in a voice calm as a winter pond, "Ain't the chair that needs fixing, it's your eyes." The man shrank, didn't say another word the rest of the afternoon. After that, something settled in Marla's chest. A strange, warm permission. Like maybe she didn't have to shrink before anyone else could. Like maybe she could take up space and not apologize. That evening she walked home slower. The town felt different, but she hadn't changed herself to make it so. That was the real miracle. On her porch, she found a small box. Inside, 2 pairs of gloves. One was clearly made for her. Sturdy, soft leather, strong seams. The other comically small. A note sat between them. For hands big enough to feed everyone, and for hands still learning how. No name. But she knew, and she smiled, not because someone had chosen her, but because he never asked her to be anything smaller. She went inside and lit the stove, her heart too full to sit still. That night she didn't cry like she usually did after town days. She baked. And this time, she didn't just make 1 extra cake, she made a dozen. The next morning, Marla rose early, her kitchen warm with the smell of sugar and yeast. She wrapped the 12 cakes, some in wax paper, some in worn cloth, and stacked them gently in a wooden crate lined with burlap. She didn't plan to deliver them all. Honestly, she wasn't sure what she was doing. But the act of baking had stirred something steady in her, like laying bricks for a new path she didn't know she'd been walking toward. Just before noon, she carried the crate to her wagon. Her arms ached from the weight, but it was a good ache, like her strength was finally being used for something that wasn't survival. At the first house, she left a cake on the porch with no note. At the second, she knocked, then turned and walked away before the door opened. By the third house, she stayed long enough to see a little girl's face light up. The mother said nothing, just nodded once, eyes wide. Word spread. By the time she got to the church steps, there were whispers again, but different now. "That's her," someone said. "The one who made those." She didn't flinch. She placed the last cake on the church stoop, then sat beside it, not waiting for thanks, just resting. That's when Reese rode up. Not quickly, not urgently, just steady, like he always did. He dismounted, took off his hat, and sat beside her without a word. A fly buzzed. The sun baked the porch planks, and still they sat. Until finally, he spoke. "I saved the one you gave me." She blinked, surprised. "You didn't eat it?" "Didn't say that." He pulled a small tin from his saddlebag. Inside was a single slice. "Wanted to eat it beside you." She smiled, slow and unsure. "It's probably stale." "So am I." She laughed. And this time, it was the kind of laugh that made her lean into him a little, without realizing. He didn't move away. Instead, he lifted the tin, broke the slice in half, and handed her a piece. "You gave these away without asking what anyone thought," he said. "That's not small. That's the biggest kind of brave." She didn't answer. She just ate, quietly, beside a man who saw her not as a charity case or a joke, but as someone worth sitting still with. People passed by, saw them there, eating together on the church steps. No shame, no fanfare, just presence. Later that evening, she found another box on her porch, this time with a note that read, "Next time, let me help carry the crate." Still no name. Still no doubt. She folded the note into her apron pocket and left it there, like a seed she wasn't quite ready to plant. But one she wouldn't throw away either. By midweek, Marla had gotten used to seeing that note folded in her apron pocket. She didn't reread it, but she didn't remove it either. It was the first thing in years that had been given to her without strings, advice, or shame. That evening, with the wind calm and the air finally turning warmer, she lit the lamp early and set about making supper. Not because anyone was coming, she told herself that part clearly, but because cooking gave her peace. The stew was thick, rich with potatoes, beans, and a handful of dried beef she'd been saving. She set 2 plates. "Habit," she said. When she heard the knock, she didn't flinch, she didn't rush. She wiped her hands, straightened her hair in the polished side of the kettle, and opened the door. Reese stood there with a small sack over one shoulder and a quiet in his eyes that matched the hush of her porch. "I figured," he said, "since you fed half the town last week, maybe you'd let me feed you back." She stepped aside. "I've got stew." He nodded once, then followed her in. He didn't look around the cabin like others didn't comment on the smallness, the plainness, the fact that everything was just slightly worn. Instead, he walked straight to the table and set down the sack. From it, he pulled 2 tin cups, a folded cloth, and something she hadn't expected, a small jar of preserved peaches. "That for dessert?" she asked, raising a brow. "For honoring whatever this is," he replied, soft. They ate mostly in silence. The only sounds were spoons tapping bowls and the occasional creak of the floorboards as the house settled with the night. She didn't feel like she had to talk, and that, in itself, felt new. When she reached to clear the plates, he stopped her. "Let me." She hesitated. "Most men wouldn't offer." He shrugged. "Most men don't bake cakes either." She laughed again, unguarded. When they sat back down, jar open between them, she asked, "Why me?" He didn't pretend not to understand. "Because you don't ask people to like you. You just give." Her eyes watered, unexpected. "And that makes me worthy?" "No," he said, slow and gentle. "That makes you seen." They shared the peaches with their fingers, sticky and sweet. She didn't worry about the way her arm brushed his, or that her body took up more of the bench than his. He didn't shift. Didn't lean away, and when he left, he didn't try to kiss her. He just said, "I'll see you soon, Marla," like it was a promise made not with passion, but with patience. She stood in the doorway long after he'd gone, hand still smelling of stew and fruit, apron still pocketed with a note, and heart full in a way that didn't feel fragile anymore. Just full. The following morning, Marla headed into town to trade eggs and flour for lamp oil. She hadn't planned on lingering, but the square was busier than usual. Livestock wagons rolling in, children shouting, and a preacher setting up a barrel to stand on near the well. As she stepped into the mercantile, conversation hushed for a beat, then picked back up like it hadn't happened. She kept her eyes forward, chin high. Mr. Green rang up her items with the same awkwardness he always did when her figure blocked the counter, and Mrs. Green gave her the usual too-tight smile. But this time, when Marla turned to leave, someone laughed. "Careful," a man said loud enough for others to hear. "Don't drop anything, bride. Town might flood." The laughter that followed wasn't loud, but it was enough. Enough to sting. Enough to make her grip the basket tighter. Enough to remind her that kindness from one man didn't erase years of public cruelty. She didn't look at them. Didn't speak. Just stepped onto the boardwalk and kept walking. But the sound followed. Snickering, whispering, a low rumble of mockery dressed as humor. She passed the saloon, eyes straight ahead. And then the crowd went quiet. Not because of her, but because someone else had arrived. Reese called her. His horse wasn't tied. He'd walked it slowly down the street, hat low, eyes fixed. Marla didn't see him at first, but the shift in the town's noise told her before she turned. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't rushing. He simply walked up to where the laughter had been loudest, right outside the smithy, and stood between Marla and the men. "Say it again," he said, not raising his voice. The laughter dried up like dust under boot. "Reese," one of them mumbled, "we were just joking. No, say it again, so everyone can hear what passes for humor now." Silence. Even the preacher paused his sermon. Reese stepped aside, just far enough to motion to Marla. "She walked past you, that's all. Carried eggs you'll probably buy next week. And you thought she was something less because she doesn't shrink?" The wind shifted. No one moved. "If any man here thinks his worth is in who he mocks, you come tell me that straight." Still, no one spoke. Reese turned to Marla, took the basket gently from her hands, and said, "You got peaches to trade next?" She blinked, unsure whether to cry or laugh. She chose neither, just nodded. Together they walked toward her wagon, the space around them widening as the crowd moved, not out of fear, but quiet respect. No one stopped them, no one called out, and when they passed the preacher, he nodded solemnly. "He who lifts the weary," he said softly, not quoting scripture, but something older, truer, "builds a house God won't forget." Marla didn't speak the whole way home. But her silence didn't feel small this time. It felt heard, It rained that night. Not a storm, just a quiet, soaking rain that made the porch creak and the hills smell of pine and dust. Marla sat by the window, shelling beans by lamplight, her sleeves rolled up, apron stained from the day's work. Across the room, Reese leaned over her kitchen table, helping her repair a broken chair leg, his sleeves soaked through, dark hair curling near his ears. They hadn't spoken much since the square, not because there wasn't anything to say, but because silence now felt safe between them. She had offered him coffee, and he'd taken it with a small thank you, like always. But when he reached for the jar of nails, his hand brushed hers, and he paused. Just a second. But in that second, something settled between them like the weight of something earned. She didn't flinch, didn't pull back. He looked at her with that same calm steadiness he always did, and said, "You still planning to trade those peaches next week?" "I might," she said, her voice soft. "If the tree forgives me for plucking too many too early." He smiled faintly, more in his eyes than his mouth. "Trees forgive easier than folks? You reckon?" "No, but you do." She stopped shelling beans, set the bowl aside. "I don't forgive easy, Reese. I forget easy. I pretend easy. That's different." He didn't move toward her. He didn't reach for her waist or her hand or her face, like men did when they thought kindness earned claim. Instead, he stood and wiped his hands on his trousers, then walked slowly to the door and stepped out into the rain. For a moment, she thought he was leaving. Then she heard him unhook the old clothesline. When he stepped back inside, rain dripping from his collar, he held the line and said, "You got a place this can run? Your laundry's soaked." It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't a kiss. But something about the way he waited, wet, shivering, waiting for her to point out the nails in the beam, made her chest ache. "There," she said, voice catching. He strung the line, shook his coat off, and hung it like it was nothing. Then turned to her and said, "I'm not here because you need me. I'm here because I like your company." Her face flushed, not from shame, not from heat, but from the sudden realization that she'd never once been liked without effort. Not once. Not until now. She stepped forward, placed a hand on his arm, and whispered, "You didn't even ask to kiss me." He looked at her like the world itself had stilled. "No," he said, "because I don't want anything I have to ask for." She stood on her toes and kissed his cheek. Not an answer, but a promise. The beans stayed unshelled. The rain stayed falling. But for the first time, Marla didn't feel unfinished. The next morning, the square was alive with trade and voices and the clang of horseshoes. Marla hadn't planned to go, but her aunt needed flour, and the last sack had to be fetched before noon. She walked with her head high, her thick dress patched but clean, the hem lifted to avoid puddles. Whispers followed her like they always did, some hushed, some cruel. "That's her, the one who bent the bench. Reese Calder's pity case. Ate more than the whole harvest crew, they say." She heard every word, didn't flinch. She'd heard worse. But then one boy, not older than 16, stepped in front of her near the blacksmith's stall and said loud enough for a circle to hear, "You gonna sit down again, miss? Or is the bench still recovering?" The laughter that followed wasn't loud. It was sharp, scattered, like stones thrown by boys who weren't brave enough to fight, but cruel enough to sting. Marla didn't cry. She didn't move, just stood still, hands clenched around the flower slip, shoulders squared, until a shadow passed over them. Reese Calder had come from the far side, his boots muddy, his coat still damp from the barn. He didn't shout, didn't swing, just walked up, picked up the boy's hat from the ground where it had fallen in mockery, and handed it back to him without a word. Then he turned toward the crowd and said, quietly, clearly, and without apology, "She makes better bread than any woman I've known, and I eat every crumb like it's a gift." The boy flushed, tried to mumble something, but Reese wasn't looking at him anymore. He took Marla's hand in full view of the town and added, "She's not some joke. She's mine. And not because I bought her, or claimed her, or needed her, because I chose her." No one laughed after that. Even the blacksmith, who had never once looked Marla in the eye, tipped his cap slightly. She could feel the burn behind her eyes, but she didn't let it fall. She squeezed Reese's hand tighter instead. Someone, maybe the baker's wife, muttered, "Well, she does make a good sourdough." That was all it took. The market moved on slowly, like shame had rained down and soaked it into silence. Reese turned to her and said, "You still want that flour?" She nodded. They walked hand in hand past the fruit sellers and the cattlemen and the gossiping mouths that had never once tasted her cooking or seen her cry. That night, she made stew and dumplings and left the door open, just in case someone ever came knocking to say sorry. No one did. But the next morning, a folded note sat on her porch with one word: respectfully. She didn't know who left it, but she tucked it into the flour jar and never mentioned it again. Because dignity, once returned, didn't need to be displayed. Only kept. The porch was quiet that evening, lit only by the warm flicker of the lamp Marla had set near the door. The breeze carried the smell of rosemary and browned butter as her stew simmered low on the hearth. Reese had cleaned up from the market, but hadn't spoken much since they returned. He'd spent most of the afternoon fixing the north fence, hands busy, jaw set, like he was working off the stares, the laughter, the memory of what they'd said. But now he was here, sitting on the top step, boots off, arms resting on his knees. Marla brought out 2 bowls and sat beside him. She didn't say, "Thank you." He didn't say, "Sorry." They just passed the bread between them. The same loaf she'd dropped the day they met. The one he'd picked up and called mine before she even knew how much she needed someone to mean it. It was golden, slightly misshapen, but soft inside, and Reese tore it without hesitation, dipped it into the stew, and nodded once, like it was enough. She watched him chew, then reach again. "That's good," he said simply. "You always say that," she replied, voice low but almost teasing. "That's 'cause it always is." He turned slightly to face her then, his eyes catching the lamp's glow. "You don't have to serve me, Marla." She blinked. "I'm not." "Then why do you always bring the bowl out first?" She looked down at her hands. "Because you always sit out here like you're not sure you're welcome inside." He didn't answer right away. Then, "You're the only place I've felt welcome in years." The silence after that wasn't awkward. It was full, like the kind of quiet that comes after rain, when nothing needs to be explained anymore. After a while, he pushed the bread plate toward her. "You didn't eat yet." "I was waiting," she said, and for the first time in days, she smiled without worry, tugging at the edges of it. Reese reached out, brushing a crumb from her chin. He didn't say anything grand, didn't lean in or make a gesture like the stories say men do. He just looked at her like she mattered, like she'd always mattered. And this moment, this meal, this porch, this night, wasn't something he was enduring. It was something he was keeping. "You ever think about what comes next?" she asked, not sure why. He nodded. "Sometimes." And I hope it looks a lot like this. Maybe a rocking chair or 2. Maybe one more loaf that don't drop." She laughed, the kind that surprised even herself. He smiled at the sound. And in that simple moment, no rings, no witnesses, No promises made. They both understood what building a life looked like. 2 bowls, 1 loaf, and no one walking away. It was nearly spring when the letter came, though the wind still bit like winter hadn't made peace just yet. Marla stood outside the post office with the folded envelope in her hand, her apron still dusted with flour and a smear of soot across her cheek from that morning's baking. Reese had gone into town early to pick up supplies, and when he returned, she was still staring at the paper. "It's from my aunt," she said quietly, handing it to him like it burned her fingers. He didn't open it, just tucked it into his vest and held her gaze. "You don't have to read it if it's just going to undo what you've already survived." She nodded, breathing deep. "I won't." Then she turned and walked home, barefoot through the muddy patch that hadn't dried yet, her heels sinking with each step. But she didn't care. Because when she reached the porch, 2 children were waiting. The baker's twins from down the lane, mouths already smeared with jam, holding a lopsided basket. "Mama said this is for you, Miss Marla," they said in unison. Inside the basket was a folded piece of paper, a notice, a formal one. The name scratched at the top read, Marla Wren, property owner, Homestead Parcel *7. She stared at it so long the younger twin asked if she was okay. "Fine," she said, voice trembling. "Just forgot what it feels like to be counted." That night, Reese nailed the deed next to the door. No ceremony, just one firm strike of the hammer. When she stepped out to look at it, he was already pouring water for the horses. "You didn't ask," she said. "Ask what?" "If I wanted your name on it too." He stopped, turned, and walked back slow, wiping his hands on his trousers. "I figured if I kept showing up, fixing roofs, sharing meals, standing beside you when folks stared, you'd decide when it was time to write my name beside yours. I was never going to take it." Her throat tightened, but she held his gaze. "It's time." He didn't smile big, just nodded once, the kind of nod that meant more than 100 yeses. By the next morning, the sign above the bakery door read, Wren and Calder Breads. Folks stopped by not just for the bread anymore, but for the laughter, the quiet joy that clung to the windows, the way Reese always stood behind the counter like a shadow that didn't block light but reflected it. When an old ranch hand asked, "You her husband now?" Reese only replied, "I'm hers, yes." That was enough. No one joked about her size anymore, not when she lifted flour sacks with ease. Not when children ran to her first, not when she smiled like she was full in every sense of the word. And at night, on the porch swing, with her head on Reese's shoulder and her hand resting where their child would soon grow, Marla whispered, "Mine." And this time, he said it back,